You broke Reddit, the Pi Day outage, a DevOps Postmortem. It was March 14, 2023 Pi Day, and for a lot of people, it was just another day on the internet. But at exactly 19 UTC, the lights started going out. In just 2 minutes, a routine upgrade pushed through to a critical Kubernetes cluster and sent the entire platform into a tailspin. Suddenly, edge traffic didn't just dip, it cratered. For 314 minutes, Reddit was effectively falling off the map as a cascading failure ripped through the infrastructure. You could feel the panic in the war room as engineers scrambled to figure out why services stopped talking to each other. They weren't just fighting a bug. They were fighting a ghost in the machine, a subtle, invisible interaction between version 1.24 and the underlying network layers. The scale was massive, the clock was ticking, and by the time they realized how deep the rot went, the only thing left to do was start praying the backups would hold. Imagine it's March 14, 2023, Pi Day. For most people, it's just a day for some nerdy math jokes, but for the team at Reddit, it turned into a full-blown infrastructure nightmare. The platform suffered a massive global outage that lasted roughly 314 minutes. It wasn't a random spike in traffic or a simple bug. It was a catastrophic failure triggered by a routine Kubernetes cluster upgrade from version 1.23 to 1.24. This specific move tripped a wire, causing a cascade of failures involving the Calico CNI and route reflectors that effectively silenced the site. To give you an idea of the scale, edge traffic plummeted almost immediately after the upgrade started at 19 UTC. When components like admission controllers and networking daemons start dropping routes across the entire cluster, your services can't talk to each other. It wasn't just a local glitch. It was a fundamental breakdown of the network fabric that brought down the whole house. It was March 14, 2023, Pi Day. For the engineers at Reddit, it started as just another day of maintaining a massive, living platform. The goal was routine, an upgrade of a critical Kubernetes cluster from version 1.23 to 1.24. On paper, it was standard housekeeping, the kind of work that keeps the gears turning and the site live for millions. They were moving toward a newer version of the orchestration layer, unaware that they were about to step into a minefield of complex interactions between Calico, route reflectors, and admission controllers. At exactly 1900 UTC, an engineer initiated the upgrade process. For a few moments, everything seemed normal, but the underlying infrastructure was already beginning to buckle under a subtle, hidden incompatibility. It was the calm before the storm, where a standard version bump was about to trigger a cascading failure that would silence the site for exactly 314 minutes. It was March 14, 2023 Pi Day. For most people, it's a day for math nerds to celebrate circles. For the Reddit infrastructure team, it was about to become a masterclass in how a minor upgrade can turn into a full-blown nightmare. Just after 1900 UTC, an engineer initiated a routine jump from Kubernetes version 1.23 to 1.24 on a critical cluster. They thought they were just moving the needle forward. Instead, they tripped a wire. 2 minutes later, the floor fell out. Edge traffic plummeted, and the "You broke Reddit" signs started flashing in neon lights across the platform. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a total collapse as Calico daemons began dropping routes like hot coals. Within 30 minutes, the war room was full. The team was staring at a massive, cascading failure where services simply stopped talking to each other, and the silence from the network was deafening. It started with a routine move, but by 19 UTC on March 14, it turned into a total meltdown. The team pushed an upgrade from Kubernetes version 1.23 to 1.24, and just 2 minutes later, the edge traffic plummeted as if someone had pulled the plug. This wasn't just a local glitch. It was a cascading failure triggered by a nasty interaction between Calico and route reflectors. Because of how the CNI handled routes across the cluster, internal communication simply evaporated. Services couldn't talk to each other, effectively isolating every component until the entire platform went dark. By the time the engineers jumped on the call, they were staring at a ghost in the machine, a subtle configuration conflict that hadn't surfaced in testing, but was now gutting their infrastructure. It wasn't just one broken node, it was a systemic collapse of the network fabric itself. So, what actually broke the site? It wasn't some random spike or a rogue script. It was a classic case of it worked in staging until it hit the real world. The team pushed a Kubernetes upgrade from version 1.23 to 1.24, and that's when the ghost in the machine crawled out. You see, this wasn't just a version hop, it triggered a nasty three-way collision between the Calico CNI, the specific way root reflectors were configured on control plane nodes, and the behavior of admission controllers like Open Policy Agent. This toxic cocktail caused the Calico node daemons to start dropping roots across the entire cluster. It was a cascading failure. Services just stopped talking to each other, effectively silencing the platform. It was an incredibly subtle interaction that slipped through every layer of testing until it hit production on Pi Day, turning a standard upgrade into a full-blown infrastructure meltdown. When the clock hit 1900 UTC on March 14, 2023, the Pi Day celebration took a dark turn. The upgrade from Kubernetes version 1.23 to 1.24 didn't just cause a hiccup. It triggered a total collapse of the platform's connectivity. For exactly 314 minutes, Reddit went dark as the cascading failure choked out edge traffic. This wasn't a localized glitch affecting a few users. It was a global blackout where services simply stopped talking to one another. The blast radius was massive, effectively silencing the site for over 5 hours of real-time chaos. The team had to watch as the scale of the failure grew, eventually forcing them into a high-risk manual restoration of the control plane and worker nodes. By the time they began trickling traffic back in at 1%, 5%, and 10% increments, the sheer magnitude of the disruption was clear: a massive infrastructure failure sparked by one subtle, overlooked interaction. The clock hit 1900 UTC on March 14, and the upgrade from Kubernetes version 1.23 to 1.24 was initiated. 2 minutes later, the floor dropped out. Edge traffic plummeted, and the platform went dark. For the next 30 minutes, the war room filled up as engineers scrambled to make sense of why the network had suddenly disintegrated. By the 2-hour mark, the creative fixes were running dry, and the mood shifted from frantic troubleshooting to a grim realization: they had to pull the big lever. They opted for a high-risk restore from backup, a desperate move that forced them to terminate worker nodes and rebuild the control plane for their largest cluster. It was a grueling, manual slog of a restoration. Once the control plane finally stabilized, they didn't just flip a switch. They gingerly bled traffic back in 1%, then 5%, then 10% until Reddit slowly crawled back to life. The situation was deteriorating fast, and by the 2-hour mark of troubleshooting, the team realized they were running out of constructive ideas. They had to make a call, perform a high-risk restore from backup. It wasn't a graceful fix. It involved nuking the worker nodes and restoring the control plane for their largest cluster, a grueling, manual process that felt like pulling teeth in a dark room. Once the control plane was finally stabilized, they didn't just flip a switch. They gingerly bled traffic back into the system in increments of 1%, then 5%, then 10% until the site was functional again. To stop this from happening on the next Pi Day, the team moved to de-risk these big footgun infrastructure changes. They're now overhauling their testing for Kubernetes upgrades and refining their restoration workflows to ensure a version jump from 1.23 to 1.24 never creates another ghost in the machine. Look, if there's one thing you take away from the Pi Day massacre, it's that a Kubernetes cluster upgrade isn't just a routine patch, it's a full-blown Bigfoot gun. When we moved from version 1.3 to 1.33 to 1.24, we didn't just hit a bug. We tripped over a nasty, invisible interaction between Calico, root reflectors, and admission controllers. It was so subtle it bypassed every standard test until the moment it blew up. The moral of the story: you have to de-risk your critical infrastructure before the how becomes a catastrophe. We also learned that relying on a high-risk restore from backup is a terrifying way to spend an afternoon. If your recovery process feels like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire, it's time to redesign it. Don't let a version bump turn into a 14-minute blackout just because you didn't account for how different components might dance together when the music changes. That's how Reddit turned a very bad day into a lesson. If this saved you an outage, subscribe for the next postmortem.